Hello. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Marta and the annual conference on South Asia for making this session possible and for holding the conference this year in this virtual fashion so that we can all participate. And especially to thank Dr. Knoyer for putting together this fascinating session on seals in the Indus. What I'm going to be talking about today is not so much the seals as the small molded artifacts of the Indus civilization, and really trying to conceptualize how they fit within this larger system of iconography on small carved or molded objects that we find within the material culture of the Indus Valley. So when we talk about Indus seals, what we're generally talking about are the traditional standard square stamp seals made of steatite with a single animal, usually a unicorn, and an inscription and the round boss on the back with the line carved through the middle and pierced. So this is the traditional object that we talk about when we talk about Indus seals. For this discussion, I want to really focus in on the types of artifacts that carry the iconography of the types that we find on Indus seals. And I would like to divide this catalog of objects into two basic categories: those that are primary supports for imagery and those that are secondary supports for imagery. The artifacts in the first group have had the imagery they are bearing produced directly onto them, either by carving, by incision, or through a process of intaglio. And these objects can include seals and tablets with incised decoration. So the most typical ones, as I mentioned, are the square stamp seals with animal motifs and generally a single line of inscription carved into steatite. In addition to these, the square seals also include a number of examples that have mythological or fantastical motifs carved onto them. And we can see a number of examples here in this image. But beyond these steatite seals, there's also a number of seals made in non-standard materials, such as silver, bronze, or even terracotta. And these seals are found at a number of sites throughout the Indus world, but also outside of it, and have not been really examined in as much depth, but they are there, and they also play the same role of being primary supports for imagery. The other truly interesting support for imagery that we find are the small copper tablets that are found primarily at Mohenjo-daro. And these include imagery that is known from seals, such as the unicorn or horned elephants or horned tigers, but also imagery that is not at all known from the seals or other molded artifacts. Things like this strange rhinoceros-like creature that seems to have the head of a rapacious bird, or this double-headed creature that looks almost like a llama, or even this horned anthropomorphic figure that seems to be covered in fur and is often shown carrying a bow. The other interesting thing about the incised copper tablets is that the imagery and the inscription found on them are typically matched. In other words, molded tablets with an elephant will often have the same inscription on them. And this is something that you don't see in the seals at all. Generally, seals have unique inscriptions on them. The last artifact that we find that are as a support for imagery in the Indus are these small incised steatite tablets that are found at Harappa, and which sometimes have imagery on one side and an inscription on the other side. Like the molded tablets, these often have repeating inscriptions, but the iconography is fairly simplified. So we have, for example, the goat here or the gabriel here with these short inscriptions on the other side. Having gone through these, what I really want to talk about today, though, are the impressions, the things we find on the secondary supports. These secondary supports reflect imagery that was originally carved or incised elsewhere and then somehow reproduced, generally through a process of stamping or molding onto them. These objects, like sealings and molded tablets, present a reflection of the primary support for imagery, but they exist also as objects in their own right, possibly adding new meanings to those embedded in the original imagery and to the meanings embedded in the original object. Secondary supports for imagery add complexity to the images they bear by their physical presence, as well as by occasionally combining a number of different primary images. So when we look at these secondary images, what we're seeing, or these secondary supports, is not only the imagery that we find on the seals or on the molds that made them, but also an object that exists in its own right, something that has meaning embedded in its physical form, as well as in the iconography that it carries. One of the truly important aspects of seals in general is the fact that they are a reproductive technology. They have the ability to create endless copies of themselves. So the imagery on the seal itself, it exists only in one place, but as you stamp it, this imagery can be propagated and distributed throughout the world in a way that a single object cannot, right? So this is something important to keep in mind as we think about the roles that these secondary bearers of imagery can play. So to look at some of the typology for these secondary supports, I'm going to just go through them very quickly. We have, for example, sealings that are impressed with seals. So sealings, or administrative sealings in particular, are in many ways the most standard kind of secondary support that we find in a seal-based administrative system, right? They can be used to lock doors, as we see in this drawing representing how sealing was carried out at the site of Shari Sokta in Iran. But we also see it today, for example, on this lock on the storeroom of Purana Kila in New Delhi. Right? This is a photo from 2015. Sealings are also used to close containers, whether bags, whether jars, whether as jar sealings. So really as a way of guaranteeing the integrity of a product. These sealings are important because they give us a view into the types of structures or projects that would be secured or protected by seals, which could be portable goods like jars or sacks, or fixed objects like doors. In the Indus, there's also evidence that seals may have been used to secure technical processes, such as the production of stoneware bangles, as is discussed by Haliman Vidale in the context of a workshop at Harappa. And here we can see this large jar used to bake stoneware bangles, which has been secured by the impression of a seal, which we can see right here. While the administrative sealings form the bulk of the secondary supports, in most ancient cultures where seals are commonly used and are therefore an expected element of the seal and seal-related corpus that we find, in the Indus, they're accompanied by a large number of other sealed and molded artifacts whose function is less obvious. The first of these are impressed tokens in various forms, and these can include round tablets or tokens that are impressed by seals. We see a number of them here. We have ones that are sealed only on one side or impressed only on one side. We have ones that are impressed on two sides. We have ones like these examples from Canmer that are impressed with, all three of them impressed with the same seal on one side, and then incised with a short inscription on the other side, and finally pierced so that they could be carried around strung on a string. Oddly, the pierced holes on these tokens pass through the center of the unicorn in the seal impression. So being able to carry them around and have them with you was more important than the impression itself. Yet you can see that the hole in each case is carefully made over the top of the unicorn and not through the body of the unicorn itself. Other secondary supports include square tablets or tokens that were impressed with seals. Here too, they could be impressed on one side, and my personal favorite is this example from Kalibangan, where we have a square tablet that is impressed with a rhinoceros seal, but which is then shaped into the shape of a seal so that it could actually be used to make impressions. It's in its own right, and you can see how it's also pierced here. We do also have square tablets or tokens that are impressed on two sides, as well as tablets or tokens in non-standard shapes, such as these sort of figure 8 shapes, kidney shapes, tree shapes, several kinds of tree shapes. And finally, we have a series of rectangular tablets that are made in terracotta or faience, which have really interesting imagery on them. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit more in depth towards the end of the presentation. But the question that I want to talk about first is how much access we have to the primary supports that were used to make the impressions on some of these secondary supports. And in some cases, it's obvious, right? In some cases, you can tell that the impression was made by a standard unicorn stamp seal. For example, this round token from Mohenjo-Daro was very clearly impressed with a round unicorn seal. Square tablets are often impressed by square seals, and you can see the form of the seal itself. A number of rectangular tablets seem to have been impressed by rectangular bar seals, the ones that have only inscription on them. And so we can see this inscription very much made by the rectangular bar seals. But then we get to some interesting examples. For example, this round token from Mohenjo-Daro, which appears to have been impressed by a round stamp seal with a unicorn on it. This is something that we would associate with the Gulf region if we were thinking about round seals. The idea that some of the seals used on these tokens may have come from other places is also emphasized by these tokens found at Mohenjo-daro that are impressed on one side with a typical Indus seal and on the other with a Central Asian style copper seal in the shape of an eagle, or here in the shape of a stepped cross. And in this case, Oscar Parpola has interpreted these as bilingual documents that could have given the owner credibility in two separate cultures. And it's important to note that tokens of this type, of the type that I've been discussing, show no sign of having been pressed onto anything for the purpose of administrative sealing, right? These are objects that existed in their own right. They didn't exist to seal or to guarantee any kind of physical object. They may have served as guarantees of an identity or an interaction, but there's no evidence that they served as a guarantee of a physical thing. What's interesting here with these is that the shape of them also doesn't mirror the shape of the seal that impressed them. And we see this also in a number of small rectangular seals that were impressed with a square stamp seal. And we have these examples from Kalibangan where we have multiples of them. So we can tell that this was an intentional thing, right? This was a bar seal that was intentionally, a small rectangular tablet that was intentionally impressed only with the top part of the seal. And we have evidence from Lothal also, where we see that when an administrative sealing is impressed multiple signs by a seal, the emphasis is placed on having the inscription be visible rather than having the figure be visible. And we see the same thing happening here, where obviously whoever was making this rectangular tablet was more interested in preserving the inscription on this unicorn seal than on the figure of the unicorn itself. Just having the top of the horn appears to have been enough. In some cases, we can posit that when we have these small rectangular tablets that were impressed on one side with an animal and on the other side with an inscription, what's actually happening is that a single seal is being impressed on both sides of the rectangle. So on one side, you have the animal motif, on the other, you have the inscription, and you can put them together and have these two elements together. Finally, however, there's a large corpus of imagery found on rectangular molded tablets that seems to be unique to these objects. Scenes like hunting scenes, or scenes of tree worship, or just imagery of plants in general that seem to be unique to these objects. And so this calls into question two things, right? One, what was the purpose of these objects? And Mark Knoyer has suggested that many of these may have served as talismans, commemorative objects that were handed out during ceremonies or events as mementos. And two, how were these images made? Because aside from this one single, very flat, very thin bar seal that is found at Mohenjo-daro, we don't have any examples of seals that would have been used to make the imagery found on a lot of these rectangular molded tablets. And so this raises the question of how were these images made? What were those primary supports that have not come down to us? The fact that they have not come down to us also raises the question of how important it was that this imagery be preserved for only one moment, right? So it's possible that these images, that these molds were destroyed afterwards, or were just not durable enough. Like we see here, right, this very thin layer right here. So there isn't a focus on creating an object. In other words, the mold itself is not what's important here. What's important is the impression of the mold and the impression that's made on multiple repeating objects. In other words, these molded tablets. It is important to remember that something like this molded tablet, where we see the impression of this seal, was actually molded or impressed on 3 sides, not just one, suggesting that 2 similar molds would have been necessary to create this artifact. In addition to the bowls, the tablet has a line of script on one side and a human figure spearing a bull on a third. On this tablet, at least, there seems to be an association between bull-on-bull combat and bull-on-human combat. Yet, if we look at other tablets, we'll see that this imagery can be mixed and matched. And we see this here, where we have this imagery of the elephant with a master of animals above it, associated in one case with the imagery of a human spearing a bull, and on the other hand, with a tiger in a tree, or occasionally on 3 sides with multiple images. And this variability can be seen in a series of 3 and 4-sided tablets from Harappa. Here we see 2 matching sides, but then the third is different. A third tablet from the site is 4-sided and combines all 4 of these scenes. And these molded tablets from Harappa highlight another important feature of these artifacts, right? The one that we started out with. They're produced in multiples, and they were fired so that they would last. A number of examples were also twisted before firing, a practice that Marta Ameri has suggested would be used to ensure that the imagery of the tablets was not copied, or which could guarantee the one-time nature of a specific grouping of artifacts. And so here we're faced with the question of, one, both repetition in the form of a number of objects, a number of images that could be created for a specific event, paired with the uniqueness of these pairings and the creation of objects that would go on to exist but in multiples but could not be repeated. And so the last thing I want to really think about as we are looking at these molded tablets is a few suggestions about the production of the molded tablets, both in terms of their imagery and in terms of their production. If we view the imagery on the molded tablets as a collection of image signs meant to highlight a belief system through a system of images that are easily recognizable to a person versed in the system, then we may be able to suggest that different arrangements of image signs highlight different aspects of that belief. The fact that the tablets are produced in multiples suggests that in specific instances, more than one example of a certain grouping of image signs was desirable. By firing these tablets, the producers created durable objects that were intended to last for a longer period of time. On the other hand, the twisting of the tablets and the absence of the original molds in the archaeological records suggests that each instance or series was meant to be unique. It has been suggested that the molds used to make the tablets were of perishable materials such as wood, so that they could be produced quickly and only be in use for a short period of time. It's also possible that they were made in steatite, but then destroyed afterwards. Whatever material was used for utilizing these molds, I would argue that since the molds themselves carried specific groupings of image signs linked to a defined moment or a dogmatic belief, they were only meant to be used for a limited amount of time. While seals are meant to be used repeatedly and had an intrinsic value as objects, the value of the molds was housed primarily in the tablets that they could be used to produce. As such, the molds probably only existed as temporary objects. And the molded tablets themselves, the objects that they created, are really the places where the meaning that they carried would then be embedded. Thank you.